Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Care Work and the Economy Project's annual meeting, the second day of our annual meeting this year. We had a very great panel presentation yesterday and very lively discussions, and we hope to continue that today. Today we have one panel planned entitled Macroeconomic Policy Tools Towards a Caring Economy. This panel will be chaired by Professor Mieke Meurs. Following that panel, we'll have a 30-minute discussion led by Professor Nancy Folbre on research gaps about the care economy. So without further ado, I will turn the mic over to Mieke, who will be chairing our first panel today.
Great. Thanks so much, Shireen, and good morning and good evening and so on to everyone. Thanks for coming. So I haven't been really deeply involved in this project, but I've been kind of peripherally involved since the very beginning, since the writing of the funding proposal and the organizational meeting at Airly as a colleague of Sergi's in the econ department at American University. It was no way to stay totally on the sidelines. So it's just really fantastic to participate in this meeting this week and to really see the results of the incredible vision and effort on everybody's part. So it's a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our panel today. So today we're turning from the microeconomic data that we looked at yesterday to the macroeconomic applications. And so I'm happy to introduce the first speaker, which will be Emel Memiş. She's from the Levy Institute, and she's gonna tell us about labor market policy in a caring economy. Emel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mieke. And good morning, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to join you today. I'm happy to be part of this team, this network. And I see too many familiar faces. So pleased to see them as well. I'm going to share and thanks also for the opportunity to work on the Korean data, which was very special and important for me, and learning experience, actually great learning experience for me, working on the unique data set that was produced as part of the project. Let me share, let's see, how can I do that? Oh, sorry. And let me do the full screen. What I'm going to share is a co-authored paper research with my colleague İpek Karacan, who has also been actively involved with this project from the very beginning. The title of our research is, actually we tried to explore how much the regulation of labor market working hours matter for Korea in enhancing a gender equal economy, whether it can be an alternative policy to think about how much the shorter labor work hours would impact in the how can I say, the gender distribution within the household of unpaid care work time, etc. So we saw during the last yesterday's session also, Korean economy shows an aging society. And it can be a challenge for the economy, plus falling fertility rates, which we saw from the graphs that Catherine showed us yesterday. And we also know that Korea, like Turkey actually, among the OECD countries, faces the gender employment and wage gaps higher than the other industrial countries as well. And to contextualize the evidence, actually what we have in our research, we also see that there has been ongoing policy intervention in Korea, which is unlike Turkey actually. There are some, but we saw much better interventions in Korean case, studying in this research. There have been provisioning of child and elderly care services with subsidies and extended parental care, and recent interventions actually with 2018. There was with the new labor standards, minimum wage increase, as well as the reduction of statutory maximum limits to weekly employment hours, which are were extremely high in Korean case, like 68 hours, and they're planning to have in a new law to decrease it 52 hours, starting with the large companies, but now it started in January 2020, I guess. It is also widened across the economy. So we wanted to kind of simulate, we conduct a simulation analysis, micro-simulation analysis, whether and how much the reduction in weekly employment hours will affect in the specific demographic group among men and women who are involved in intensive childcare. So continuing from yesterday's discussions, we observed that the childcare, how can I say, dynamics show a highly dependence on parental care in Korea, like the case in Turkey. But unlike Turkey, there are a lot of alternative external care services, but those are used as complementary to parental care, not as substitutes. So the family-based care system, basically depending on the perception of women's role as the primary caretakers, have been shown by other researchers, and there are a lot of evidence supporting this structure. We also observed long employment hours, as I said, and there have been high gender gaps still, despite all these different alternative external care services are provided. And Korea ranks like third worldwide after Mexico and Costa Rica in terms of annual work hours. So this is kind of different, peculiar to Korea among the OECD countries. Now, what we did specifically in our research, we used the unique data set, CCS, that is the Care Work Family Survey and Childcare, which has been, as I said, conducted under the Care Work and Economy project. And it has two components, but we focused on the childcare component, which provided a rich set of data on the respondents as women's and their spouses' time allocation patterns, and stratified cluster sampling based on the proportion distribution by region and sex have been used. So it represents, in a sense, all the regional distribution of Korea, representing 4.3 million children under 10 years old in Korea. So we also discussed the peculiar and uniqueness of the data set yesterday. I'm not going to go into details, but using that data set, we explored the potential reduction, again, to repeat, of full-time market work hours towards narrowing of the gender gaps in paid and unpaid work. And for this, we conducted two policy alternatives, two alternative simulations as phases, first from 68 hours per week to 52 hours, and then further decline to 40 hours per week. So this figure shows, in a sense, how much the external care services are used and at what time of the day they're being used by this specific group of households. As you observe, the use of daycare peaks between 9 a.m. and 2 p.m., which is the yellow part of the graph. We observed, compared to parental care, lower use of private academy and institutional care type of services, which peaks between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., the lower part of the blue of the graph. And from this was one of the evidences that actually enabled us to construct our model to estimate. There seems, we observe the incompatibility actually of working hours with school hours. And even though these type of different external services are used, they're limited in terms of hours and not used by all the households in this specific group. This table shows the main averages actually, and shows how the gap between women and men in terms of paid work and care work differ between weekends, and if you include the weekends or exclude them. around 15 hours, as we can see, women's weekly paid hours, which is also very high compared to the KTUS, the national representative, not the paid work hours, I'm sorry, which is also very low compared to the national representative paid work hours in KTUS. Weekly work hours is the opposite, actually. When we include the weekends, it's like 8 hours per day, 57 hours. And in total, adds up to more than 70 hours per week for women. And when we look at the spouses' time allocation, we see almost the opposite. Paid work hours is like 57 hours, and care work hours is like during the weekends only 6 hours per week, and which doubles when we include the weekends, but still very low, 12 hours per week among men. And the gender gap is quite high, given these numbers. Paid work time is like -42. When we, how can I say? When we get the difference between women's and men's averages, and unpaid care work time is the opposite, 45 hours. In total, women work 3 hours longer than men among, again, these specific households. What we did here is like, while exploring the data, we checked, the one on the left actually shows, corresponds to averages that I just showed in the previous slide, spouses' weekly care hours, how that differs with from women's weekly care hours. And the one on the right shows us the survey is very special, giving us, asking alternative questions for the paid work hours. So it's not just a stylized usual weekly paid hours, but also they give us the information about when people leave their home for work and then when they come back from work. So we also wanted to include the commuting time for work, how much that differs between the usual and actual work hours. That also helped to get some higher variation actually in the data set, because when you ask people how long you work for usual working hours, they usually say the legal one or the maximum statutory, widely used working hours. So this shows the right-hand side distribution of the usual one and the one we calculated as the actual work hours. As you see, it's skewed to the right and shows a quite different distribution actually compared to the usual one. And then as a first step, given this evidence, while thinking about the construction of the model, what kind of, again, we did strong assumptions, but all those assumptions needed, depends on the actual evidence that is provided by the studies and the empirical data that we were using. So as the first step, we tried to analyze. In our simulation, we were going to ask how much the reduction in the paid work hours of spouses would affect their care work, how much they're going to participate within the household in care work, and then how that will affect women's care work time and paid work time. So first, we want to see whether men's care work time vary in a sense, depending on their paid work time. And similar to Turkey, actually, in also Eun's methodology paper, we read that men actually do not respond in terms of their paid care work time to their employment hours. But opposite to that, in a sense, what we did here is we wanted to check whether we see significant differences between the short working hours and longer working hours in terms of ranges, how much that affects controlling for demographic factors like age, education, region, etc., etc. So the base group, we estimated separately for dual earner households and single earner households here. And our base group was less than spouses working less than 40 hours per week. And compared to that, men actually really spend, how can I say, when they spend longer hours in the labor market, that affects their care work time. And we got significant results in terms of the change in their care work time compared to paid work time. So depending on this evidence, plus depending on other researchers, literature, doing the literature review that women behave as or perceived as a second earner within the household, and men are just helpers. What we did is empirically, we set up a recursive model, but also estimated all the three equations simultaneously, allowing for correlations and endogeneity between unpaid work time and paid work time, as well as spouses and wives, women's unpaid and paid distribution. So starting from the last equation, actually, the third one, recursive, meaning that paid work time and care work time of men determines, in a sense, plays a role in determining women's paid and care work time, but not vice versa. So we started with the third equation. And there we see S, spouses' paid work time, as one of the variables on the right-hand side. And that is treated as exogenous. So we're going to simulate through that variable. And on the left-hand side, as the dependent variable, we see spouses' care work time. And then depending on spouses' care work time in the second equation, we put women's care work time on the left as a dependent variable. And step by step at the top, we observe how paid work time of women depends on their own care work time. Of course, we control for X, H, Z, all the vectors of individual and household characteristics, and the parameters, theta, etc., all the coefficients that we are looking for, especially for the interested variables that we are interested. The individual and household characteristics, among them, we include the age of youngest child, the number of children younger than 10, spouse's income group, whether the household received outside help on child care or not, and whether that help is part-time or full-time. And as a result of this estimation, we got the relation, the main coefficients that we could use in our simulation. This could be read as if the spouse's paid work time decreases by 10 hours per week, spouse's weekly care hours increases by 2.2 hours. When spouse's weekly care hours increase by 2.2 hours, higher than 1, we got the coefficient for spouses' weekly care hours and women's weekly care hours. So that gives us a higher than, for women's, the increase is higher than the decline in men's care work hours. So we got like 2.4 hours decrease in women's care work, and then that is reflected in women's paid work hours, which is also higher than 1, the coefficient. So it gives us 3.3 hours longer paid work for women if the decline is 10 hours at the beginning. Now, as a result, using those coefficients and all the estimation results and coefficients and the correlations between the equations are in the paper. If requested, I'm happy to share. And we applied 2 alternative simulations. The first one is the maximum amount of work is 52 hours per week. As you can see, let's start from the column 3 and 4. This shows in the baseline, the actual average hours for men is 60 hours almost, 59.9 hours per week, and care work hours is 5.7. And with the simulation, when we limit spouses with 52 hours, we get an average as 52 hours for men and 7.5 hours care work time for men in the first, as an outcome of the first policy scenario. It's like a 2 hours increase in care work time for them. And in the second simulation, the paid work time is limited to 40 hours per week. And we see a larger impact, like 5 hours, from 5.7 to 9.9 hours care work time for men. How that is reflected on women's paid work time and care work time. And on the left-hand side, you see how much of the sample is affected by the first simulation and the second simulation. So almost half of them are working longer than 40 hours. So the sample size is larger in the second simulation. Women's paid work time and care work time, as you can see, compared to the baseline, increases only 3 hours in the first simulation for first policy scenario. In the second one, it increases like 7 hours per week, 1 hour per day. And as a result, we could calculate the gender gap, and we see a huge decline in the second scenario, actually, from 32.5 to 5.6. I mean, like from 30 to 5.6, the gap, the gender gap in paid work time, but also 10 hours decline in the care work time. So the policy scenarios, actually, that we got from the simulations, also we wanted to see if the working hours of the spouses decline, whether they will prefer to spend it in the leisure time activities, or they'll get involved in care work activities. This was difficult, and we didn't have the full 24-hour distribution of their time. It will be better to understand and explore the substitution in a sense. But what we used, as yesterday in the third presentation, as a measure of well-being, we could check the, thanks to the survey variables, whether the actual and desired time shows us how much this would improve, whether this will be preferred or not, in a sense. So as a well-being indicator, we calculated the difference between the actual and desired care hours. As you can see in the third and fourth column, women's and men's, women's are positive because they're spending much higher than they prefer, 32 hours per week in the actual sample. And then when we get the differences, it declines by 2 hours. But for men, it was interesting also. In the first policy scenario, they are really demanding much higher care work time for themselves. They like to get involved in child care longer than they do actually. So we see the difference between the actual and desired care work time declines for them as well. And it's almost zero in the second policy scenario. So coming to the end, these are the main highlights of the study, actually. We see a significant impact of reducing working hours. It could be a very interesting policy alternative to think about, especially in the industrialized countries, not maybe in other countries, that we cannot convince people to work less if they're living under poverty, but at least there are many different alternatives to think about how people will agree instead of wage increases. Maybe they bargain for shorter hours of work, etc. There are many thoughts that are now being discussed among the networks, especially in the UK and European countries. And we see new laws are being passed in some of the European countries as well. And as I said, states are committed to transformative policy intervention as well by the international conventions to narrow down the gender gaps. So this, in a sense, showed us a new way to look at, because in Turkey also we've been working to how can I say, to advocate, to do some advocacy among the women's associations to increase, to widen the how can I say, the care services, external care services publicly, but it may not be the end point if people are not willing to use those child care services, or they're not able to use those external, no, I don't mean that. If they're not able, in a sense, given the social values and patriarchal values within the society, so it will be informative, it will be transformative to start with shorter working hours. And yesterday's discussion was very interesting. At the end, Beth mentioned about how we see within the surveys that fatherhood dynamics and the patterns, and the surveys on masculinity, surveys on fatherhood show us that men are willing to involve more in childcare within the households, but the policies, the public policies, are lagging behind. So I totally agree, and there's I hope these findings would also help contribute to these discussions. So thanks, Mieke.
Great. Thanks so much, Emel, for such an interesting presentation. So I think I'll follow the strategy that Ki-Soo used yesterday of just taking clarifying questions quickly now, and then having the more discussion-based questions at the end. I see that Nancy had in the chat one clarifying question, which is, how exactly is care work defined, the wording of the survey question, and is it disaggregated at all?
Yes, it is the aggregated one, but in detail, we only saw the in English version of the data set, that how much they spend on childcare. So it's the total amount of time, maybe in the detail activities in the form itself. They asked in all different kinds of for child development, including supervisory activities, etc. But we use the whole of the aggregated one.
And Sergi is asking if you could say a little bit about the sampling design.
Oh, the sampling design, let me open up the methodology paper actually in the network. Maybe Ki-Soo can help me on that side. This stratified sampling with all the metropolitan areas, depending on the, what they do is they look at the regional distribution of children's population, and then they sample, let me open up the paper. I didn't prepare that one. Okay, here, children aged below 10, in total 4.3 million across across Korea, but it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 16 regions, which are, some of them are, I cannot pronounce probably correctly, Gwangju, Seoul, Gyeongbuk, Gyeongnam, all are the most populated areas. So percentage of children by region are taken as the main framework for the sampling strategy. And survey sample distribution of respondents was done according to that. It is the number, the total number is 494, almost 500. And the distribution is done by the regional distribution of population distribution. This is for child care only, and for elderly care who are involved in intensive care. I've not worked with that one, but I can share the part of the methodology paper, because it has more detailed stratification analysis and how they weighted the sample using that regional distribution. So I can share that. And the children's distribution by sex, etc. There's a very rich descriptive analysis in that paper.
Okay, thank you. Okay, probably we should move on, saving other questions to the end. So our next speaker will be Martín Cicowiez, who is from Universidad Nacional de La Plata, And he's going to speak to us on child and elderly care in South Korea, policy analysis using CGE model. So Martín, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. Regrettably, I mean, this is a work that has been done together with Hans Lofgren. He's not here today, so I will blame him of all the errors in the paper. Okay, so I will talk about the computable general equilibrium model that we developed for Korea in order to assess the impact of different policies related to child care, elderly care, and the gender wage gap in Korea. So let me start with some context. I mean, this was already mentioned today and yesterday. This is for Korea. We see the total fertility rate has been going down and it's very low today. Here we see that the size of the elderly population is going up at the same time that the size of the children population is going down. And in the last graph, we see that the wage gap, the gender wage gap in Korea is the highest among the OECD countries, and it's almost 35%. So this is the context from which we define our simulations. The policy context was already described. There is a universal child care policy. There is a long-term care insurance scheme in Korea. And again, the simulations will be related to those policies. So let me talk about the method, and then I will define the simulations, and then I will show the results. So the question is why it makes sense to develop a CGE model to assess these issues in the case of Korea. So what we argue is that if we develop a model that is well structured and with the right disaggregation, we can capture the different government policies that can address these challenges, taking into account the provision of care services, the female labor force participation, the gender wage discrimination. And we can do that taking into account also social and economic outcomes, like time use, household well-being, and we can split the production between GDP and non-GDP. By GDP, we mean everything that it's usually part of the national accounts, and by non-GDP, here we mean the production of household services. So based on all this, we developed a new model, which is called GEM-Care, the General Equilibrium Model for Care Analysis. And it's related to previous literature, notably Fontana and Good, and it's also related to some of the models that we developed together with Hans in the past. So why it makes sense to develop a CGE model again? The main reason for developing a CGE model is that we can think about these issues in a general equilibrium context, which means that we will take into account the consistency between the different parts of the economy, in the sense that we are going to be looking at the GDP production, the household service production of what I called before the non-GDP production, the factor markets, most notably the labor market split between male and female. We will have the government policies, and we will have the household consumption, and we will be taking care of the relationship between these different components of the economy. So we already know that most of the household service production is mostly women, and the GDP production in the case of Korea is mostly men work. So in order to calibrate the model, we had to develop a social accounting matrix, which is the main data source for this type of model. A social accounting matrix, for those of you that are not familiar, is a picture of the economy that shows all the links between the different parts. So its main data sources are the national accounts, particularly the supply and use tables. And in this case, given that we are expanding the production sphere, we used information from the time and use survey for Korea. And in order to do that, we have to value the time spent on care services, on non-care services, production within the household, and also leisure. So we have to work on valuing that, and we use the replacement method. So how much would it cost to a household to buy out in the market the services that are being produced by household members? So we did that, and we used that social accounting matrix to calibrate the model. In the sum, we have like 46 activities and commodities. We have 4 labor categories. We split labor by skill and gender. And it is interesting that we have 3 households. So we have 3 representative households, and we split the households based on their care needs. So we have one group of households, which are households with a working age head with children, then households with a working age head without children, and then we have households with an elderly head. So we have 3 different households with different care needs. And in the social accounting matrix, we take into account the care transfers among the different households. It can be the case that a working household is providing a care transfer to the elderly household, for example, and the other way around for childcare. So that is taken into account in the social accounting matrix and into the model. Okay, so besides splitting the production between GDP activities and the non-GDP activities, the production of household services, and taking into account the care transfers, we also extended the model with wage discrimination following the work by Gary Becker, which is basically to assume that there is taste discrimination in the sense that the wage for women is lower than the wage for men, and that is because of it's because of an underestimate of the marginal productivities of women relative to men. The way in which we model this is it works like a tax that it's being charged into the women wage, but the tax collection goes to the capital factor within that activity, and we can have like different wage gaps among the different activities. Okay, so it's like a distortion. So these are the simulations that we ran with the model. This is a dynamic model. We start in 2018 and we ran the model until 2030. That's the business as usual scenario. That's the first scenario, the base. No policy changes. And then we have 2 scenarios in which we increase government spending, first on childcare. And the reason for running this scenario, even though there is universal coverage for childcare, is that there are concerns about the quality of the childcare services. So we increase the spending per child in childcare services. And this is the scenario is defined as an in-kind transfer from the government to the households with children. Then we have a similar scenario, but in this case, the in-kind transfer is directed to the elderly households. So it's an in-kind transfer in elderly care. And finally, we decrease the wage gap by 50%. All these non-based scenarios start to differ from the base in 2022. And in the non-based scenarios, we assume that the additional fiscal space to finance some of these policies comes from an income tax. And in the paper, we have additional scenarios, one in which we decrease the wage gap between care workers and the rest of the economy. We increase the fertility rate, and then we have a combined scenario. So let me go to some of the results. Here we show the change from the base in time use in care services. And we make a difference between paid and unpaid care, and we are looking at the last year of the simulation. So we have the three scenarios: the increase in government spending in child care, elderly care, and the decrease in the wage gap. And what we see here is that both for men and women, there is an increase in the paid care work when there is an increase in the government spending in child care. The increase is higher for females because care services, both within home and outside the home, are intensive in the use of female workers. So that's why these two are higher than the other two. And in all cases, we see that there is a decrease in the unpaid care for women and men, okay? So there is a switch from home to the market for care. If we look at the total time use, and again, we split that between paid and unpaid, and in this case, we have leisure, we see that for females, there is an increase in GDP work or paid work. There is an increase in the unpaid work. That is true for the three simulations, but there is also a decrease in leisure time. So we cannot say for sure what's going on with the well-being of women here. Okay, so for males, we see that a similar pattern of changes in the first two scenarios, the ones in which the government increases spending. But when we look at the decrease in the gender wage gap, we see that there is a decrease in the paid work for men, and there is an increase in the unpaid work for males. So there is a substitution within the house. Certainly, what would be interesting is to see if we can extract from the previous paper that was presented, the value for the elasticity of substitution that determines how large is the switch between men and women within the household. Okay. Okay. If we look at the valuation of time by gender, we see that there is an increase in the value of paid work, both for men and women, but that the increase is larger for women when there is an increase in government spending. And that, again, that is related to the factor intensity or the labor intensity of the care services sectors. Those sectors are more intensive in the use of female labor. Okay, and when we look at the decrease in the wage gap, we also see an increase in the labor income, or the valuation of time, let's say, because we are taking into account unpaid labor for women. And we can infer from these results that we can think from this result that the bargaining power within the household for women might go up because there is an increase in the market income for women. Okay, Then we can look at the household consumption split between what we are calling GDP consumption and non-GDP consumption, which is consumption of services produced within the household. And here we are showing results for the 3 household groups that we have in the model. And some of the things that are interesting from here is that, for example, when we increase government spending in elderly care, we see a decrease in the transfer in the care transfer from the working households to the elderly household. That's this orange results. So we see that the amount of time spent in unpaid work, unpaid care work for the working households goes down, because within the elderly household, there is a switch from unpaid care to paid care that it's now financed with a care transfer from the government. Overall, what we see is that there is, in the first 2 scenarios, there is a switch from the unpaid care or the non-GDP to the paid care or the GDP services, mostly in this case. And we see the same when we decrease the gender wage gap. There is an increase in the consumption of GDP services here, okay? So, of course, these results are sensitive to the assumptions. Specifically, we are assuming that there is a substitution between the work of men and women, both within the household and in the market. So we tested the sensitivity of the results. Actually, we tested the sensitivity of the results to everything at the same time. But here I'm focusing on these key elasticities. Specifically, this is the elasticities between male and female work, both within the household and in the market. And what we see is that the higher the elasticity, the higher will be the increase in paid employment for women when there is a decrease in the wage gap. And we see, we have the same result for the work when we increase government spending in childcare and elderly care, specifically when the elasticity that we increase is the elasticity within the household. So the easier it is within the household to switch from unpaid care work by women to unpaid care work by males, there will be a larger increase in the female paid employment. Okay, so, and we can quantify that results. So the concluding remarks, the results show that these policies that address care and wage discrimination can make a difference by improving the well-being of households with care responsibilities, in the case that they can increase their overall consumption. They free up time for women so that they can work on jobs that match their education. And rising women's wages relative to men's, we see that it affects or changes the incomes, but it also encourages changes in the gender time use, okay? And then we see that if we focus on the GDP part of the economy, we may get like misleading results in the sense that we can see gains in GDP production at the expense of decreases in non-GDP sectors. And and leisure time. So that is something that it is important to take that into account when we look at these issues. And then what is interesting is that we see that there are trade-offs, and that is important when we design policies related to these issues, that we take into account the interactions among the different issues that we are discussing here. Like, for example, if we don't take into account an increase in the government in the provision of child care services and elderly care services, at the same time that we promote policies to decrease wage discrimination, we may get some undesirable results. So it's good to think in terms of a package so that we tackle the different issues at the same time. And as we saw, the size of the adjustments will depend on the flexibility of gender roles, both within the households and in the labor market. And I will stop here so that I stick to the 15 minutes time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Martin. So again, are there some questions of clarification that people would like to ask before we move on? I can see there's some questions in the chat, but they maybe Ajit's question. So can you please clarify further regarding the impact of unpaid care work? What is the extent of the decline in weekly hours of unpaid care work for men and women as a result of the policy intervention? If you could explain a little bit the mechanism, that would be helpful.
Okay, the mechanism. So what we are running is a simulation in which we increase an in-kind transfer from the government to the households. And within the household, we assume that there is the possibility of substitution between care services provided by household members with care services provided by the market. And the in-kind transfer from the government to the household is for care services provided by the government, by the market. So we assume that household can substitute one for the other one. So when there is an increase in the transfer from the government to the household, the relative price, let's say, of the household services will go up, and so there will be a switch to the services provided by the market. That's
okay.
That's the mechanism.
Thank you. It seems that we need to move on for reasons of time. So I want to introduce our last speaker, Gretchen Donehower from University of California, Berkeley, who will be speaking about evolving demographic change and care support in Korea and the US. Gretchen.
All right, I have managed to unmute myself. Yay. So this work is with Bongo Ki, professor of sociology at Kookmin University, who's also on here. But all the mistakes are mine. Just kidding, I won't throw him under the bus. So let's see, here we go. Okay, so care support ratios are meant to be a simple method to evaluate how demographic change may impact care economies. So in looking at market-based economies, support ratios get used a lot to talk about demographic dividends, things like that. So this is just a way to bring the care economy into that kind of framework, and also most especially include the unpaid care work part of the care economy, which is so often overlooked. So the method has three parts. The first is estimating age profiles of some type of care. And we have the age profiles are of production and consumption. So production is what we're usually focusing on when people talk about the care economy, but we also have an imputation so that we can see who in the economy, by whatever characteristic, is consuming the care that gets produced. So because we want this to be a gender aware method, we can separate this out by sex or any other characteristic that is important to the care economy. So in other work, we've separated these age profiles out by socioeconomic status to see how the care economy functions differently depending on SES. The units I'm going to show today are all in terms of time, but as most of this group knows, you can impute a wage to unpaid care activities and put everything in monetary terms as well. So the second part you need to produce these ratios is some scenario of future change. So what I'll be showing today is a future change in the population provided by population projections to show what population aging is going to affect the care economy. Or this scenario could be in the care economy itself, so how the age profiles are going to change, or like we saw in the previous two papers, if there is a scenario of policy change and an interaction between the two. Although that adds a great deal of complexity, and one of the things I like about this method is how straightforward it is. So when you have the age profiles in a scenario of the future, you combine those two to estimate the aggregate production and consumption and take the ratio to give you the care support ratio. So we usually put the production on the top of the ratio so that we get a sort of average production available to support the consumption that we project will be demanded in the future. So here are two age profiles of parts of the care economy. So this is focusing on just unpaid care work. So that includes direct care activities, but also indirect care, so direct care of children, elders, community members, but also indirect care provided through housework, household maintenance, and management. The heavy solid lines are for Korea, the dotted lines are for US. So this comes from the American and Korean time use surveys, and this is looking at 2014. So what we see here is the general pattern we would expect of women doing quite a bit more unpaid care work. There's sort of a double hump shape here. The most intense production age groups are in the child-rearing years of the 30s. And then there's sort of another hump here that's associated partly with retirement. As you do less paid work, you shift towards more unpaid care work for yourself and your household. And then also grandparents provide a lot of care in both of these societies. So then over here is the consumption side. So how do we get that? In our time use surveys, we have the full household roster in both of these surveys. So I know from the time use survey how much care work is being produced in that household. And then I have numerical methods to impute who in the household by age and sex is consuming that time. So we see that the most unpaid care work is produced in households with the youngest people. So these numeric methods give high household or unpaid care work consumptions to infants, and then very low as you enter adulthood, and then increases again in older persons, although more so in the US than in Korea. So we've talked a bit, a few people have mentioned the issue of secondary or activities or supervisory care. So this, for the US, so these are both just US here, shows between the dotted lines, which were shown in the US slides previously, and then the solid lines, how much more care you get when you include the supervisory care of kids and also for elders. So that's in the American Time Use Survey, asking if you were also caring for children age 0 to 12, or if you were caring for elders because of a condition related to aging. So for some age groups, this almost doubles the total amount of care time. So it takes a 40-hour-a-week job on average for women in those peak child-rearing years and turns it into about a 70 or so hours per week. So that's a lot of additional time. And of course, this frame also doesn't include times like when your, say, infant would be asleep and you still have to be there, but it's not considered that secondary activity. So maybe an understatement in some ways. And so how does that secondary care or supervisory care flow through to the consumption estimates? Well, you can see here that most of that secondary care is for children. So it increases the estimates for infants from about almost 60 hours a week to almost 120 hours a week that they're consuming. And of course that overlaps. There could be two people caring at the same time, but we are adding those up for kids. And then there's some increase at older ages, but not as much, or much less. And I should say that sort of one of the reasons, at least in my brief association with time use research, that we don't have good incorporation of secondary or supervisory activities is that it's done so differently in different time use surveys. So I think we would get a lot more sort of buy-in across the time use research world in including this if we would agree on one best way or maybe two best ways to do it, and then got more harmonization across our survey instruments. So here we're going to move on to the paid care work economy. So we want to look at the care economy in a completely holistic way, combining all types of care, paid or unpaid, all age groups, children and elders. And so this is sort of a first stab at the paid care work side. Now, this is just sort of, the non-professional groups. And so how do we get these data? So for the US, it was the current population survey, and for the census, or for Korea, it was from the census. And there are occupation codes for people who are asked what they do. And so those occupations are coded up and also asked how much time they spend in the labor force. So obviously we have some difference in the occupation codes from the US versus Korea, because in the US, these non-professional occupations, and what it's meant to be are childcare workers, home health aides, workers at adult daycare centers, things like that, and also housekeepers. And so people who are providing those services, but probably didn't have to get a ton of extra education. They most likely had some credentials or qualifications they had to meet, but it wasn't sort of years of medical school and things like that. So in the US, we see, of course, a big gender gap in who's doing this kind of work. It's overwhelmingly women. Same thing in Korea, but the reason that we probably need to go back and work on our occupational codes is that in the US, these occupations are being done by women at pretty much all the ages in the labor force, whereas in Korea, it's very centered on women who are in their late 50s. So, and men are doing this in Korea almost not at all. And you'll notice too that this is hours per week. So this is averaged across the whole population. So on average across all the population, you get a low hours per week. And now how do we do the consumption imputation? So I know how much time workers are spending in these occupations, who is consuming that time. So here I use the Consumer Expenditure Survey in the US and to get how much households are paying for these kinds of services. So how much are households paying for childcare, home health aides, things like that, both out of pocket and insurance or supported by public sources. And so I don't have the same thing in Korea yet, but we're working on that. So I just used the US shape for the Korean data to be able to move forward. So kids are consuming most of these hours. As for older persons, there's an increase, but it's not huge. And so that just reflects really how much time is being produced in these different occupations. So childcare versus, say, home health aides or adult daycare workers. Now, these are paid care work production and consumption also, but of those more professionalized occupations. So this includes teachers at all levels, and then medical care providers, so doctors, nurses, and other kinds of medical care providers who would be directly providing services, and also social workers. So those folks had to have gone to school for a long time, and they're much more intensive sort of credential requirements and things like that. So that's why we put them in a different group. And here we see that between the US and Korea, so again, Korea is the thick lines, and the US is the dotted lines. So these, the time that workers are spending in these types of occupations looks much more similar across the two countries. Although, and again, we see that women are doing a lot more of this stuff than men. The interesting thing to me here is the tilt to younger ages in the Korean data. That could be a cohort effect. So these cohorts sort of moved into these occupations more strongly than their mothers had. And so maybe this shape will change over time as those cohorts age. Now, how to get the consumption imputation. So I know this looks a little messy, but that's because of some smoothing issues with education. So to impute who is actually consuming the time that these folks are producing, I use the National Transfer Accounts age profile. So that NTA project takes market activities and national accounts and disaggregates those by age. So for doctors and nurses and other medical care providers, this includes how much people by age are consuming of all those services, and that's whether it's paid out of pocket or by insurance companies or by publicly provided or underwritten insurance. And then for education, same thing. So that's how much people by age are consuming of education across all types of payers and providers, so public or private. And we do those in separate sectors. So education is separate from the healthcare, and then combine them to get this overall imputation. So given the hours that I see produced over here, they are being consumed by younger people in terms of education, but then a lot of the healthcare hours are being consumed by older persons who are consuming a lot more healthcare. So what is the future demographic change that I want to pair with my current snapshot of the care economy? So as other presenters discussed, Korea is a rapidly aging population. The US is aging now as well. Both populations have below replacement fertility. This wasn't true in the US for a long time, but now is. And so these bars are showing the proportion of population over time. So from 2020 in the light gray, all the way up to 2050 in the black. So we expect in both societies that there will be fewer young people over time and far more in the 80+ group. And then, so we'll have an older society, and that process is more rapid in Korea than the US, but that the US is facing similar. So here are the care support ratios themselves. And so what the care support ratios do is take all of those age profiles totting around back here, and then use population projections over time to get an aggregate estimate of the consumption over here, and then the production over here, and then the consumption over here, and compare those in a ratio over time. So, and across the bottom, the bars that show the relative change in those support ratios compared to 2020 have just sort of different types of different sort of slices of the care economy. So for unpaid care work over here in Korea, we see that relative to 2020, in 2030, this bar is actually higher. So why is that? Well, part of population aging, while it does sort of move people out of the peak productivity ages in terms of both producing unpaid care and paid care and market work, and is that you have fewer very time expensive children. So this support ratio goes up a little bit, which is the analysis telling us that the shape of demographic change in this small time window is actually making it easier to provide the current levels of care that my care economy is giving out to people. Now, I should say, to preface that rhetorically, that sort of makes it seem like right now is just fine. And I am looking at whether we will still be just fine in 10, 20, 30 years. So that's certainly something I don't want to say, because we know that certainly from other work we've heard about today, that there's a lot of not just fine at all. There's a lot of people who are expressing the opinions in these survey instruments that they were providing a lot more unpaid care or other kinds of care than they would like to. So while numerically it sort of assumes that 2020 is fine, I should say that's not what I'm trying to say here. It's just saying whether population change from 2020 is going to make it harder or easier to do things as we're doing them today. And so over the next couple of time slices, population aging continues, and our care economy in Korea on the unpaid care work side is going to have a harder time providing the levels of care to people that those consumption age profiles implied. So I don't have my supervisory care here for Korea, but over in the US, looking at the difference between the unpaid care work impacts over time versus when I include the supervisory care, they're not much different. And that's because the age nature of that supervisory care, at least in terms of the producers, just sort of shifts the production up. Everybody's doing this supervisory care. So in terms of the aging implications, when I think about supervisory care, they're not very large. Now, this paid care work for the non-professional sectors over time has a much bigger challenge from population aging. And then when I look at the professional care workers, that's even bigger. So, and then we see the same relative patterns in the US, although the challenges are much less. And that's mostly because the US pace of aging is slower. Now, let's see, I'm sorry, just reviewing what else I wanted to say. So this is a pretty simple demonstration, but I think at least it shows the idea that age profiles and care support ratios are powerful, flexible tools for measuring and understanding care economies. Now, we could have taken those age profiles and looked at them in many different ways. As I mentioned, socioeconomic status is one of the big sort of additional characteristics that we like to chop these analyses up into, because in terms of policy messages, that's going to be probably the most salient in trying to address these shortfalls and problems. So which groups are having the problems? Because if you're not focusing on that, you could design a policy that solves the problem for a group that doesn't really have it. So that's what I wanted to demonstrate today. And I know it was sort of a whirlwind and I left a lot of the details out, but we can talk about those as we go along. So thanks very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Gretchen. Okay, so we have about a little under 15 minutes for discussion. I think there was one question in the chat. So I wanted to first encourage everyone to look at the chat. I think a lot of the questions in the chat have sort of been responded to in the chat, so I don't want to go through all of them. There was one question, Robert Blecker had a question, Gretchen. I'm wondering, what was that bump in consumption of care in Korea for the early 30s, maternity care, and why don't we see that in the US?
All right, so let me go back and see.
That was rather a detail, but I was wondering about.
Yeah. I mean, it could be a smoothing issue. It could just be some kind of cohorty effect. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'll note that and see if we can figure that out going forward.
Great. Okay, so then I just like to open it up. So I think people could just unmute yourself and speak unless suddenly there's chaos, in which case we'll have to raise our hands, but let's just start.
I think Oslam has her hand up.
Great.
So Oslam, please unmute.
Yeah, thank you. I'm, I think, too well behaved to just start speaking without being allowed to do so. But thanks for the liberty. 2 points to Emel. I mean, thank you very much. You have really done the paper that I would have loved to have done myself about this downward convergence in working hours. And I'm very happy that you're able to show that. One thing I would like to maybe add to the simulation is a further simulation with a reduction to something like 35 hours, because the reduction in hours have to be creating jobs for women. But if the reduction is too little, too few hours, the labor demand effect of that may be quite restrictive. Whereas if you're moving from 60 hours a week to 35 hours a week, certainly you can create double shifts in many industries, in which case you create also labor demand with that shortening. I think that would exactly also give you the perfect convergence in hours, because you ended up with 40 hours for men and 34 hours for women with the 40-hour simulation. So the next step, and 35 hours is actually a very realistic thing. It happens in the rest of the world with similar productivity rates to Korea. The second thing is maybe really, I mean, you started by saying creating demand isn't enough. So we looked at now the labor supply response by legislative shortening of the working hours. I like where you're coming from, but probably combining to two sides are important, because we need to create the jobs and shorten the working hours. And that's the really almost the magic mix of policy. But I really loved what you did. Thanks for that. And 3 questions to Martin. Is the change in public spending in childcare or elderly care or wage rates leading to any differences in your production function? Because what we expect or we find in our research is that all 3 of these policies, changes in public spending, in sort of care infrastructure, as well as in the wages, lead to higher productivity, higher output per hour of labor. I suppose you have a unchanging production function in the background. So it would be interesting to look at parameter sensitivity with some even assumed exogenous productivity shock coming from your public spending or wage shocks, even if you don't endogenize it. Obviously, if you endogenize it, it would be great, but it's asking too much from a model that's already probably very complicated. You could introduce, just as you did the parameter sensitivity with the substitution effects, you could introduce exogenous changing productivity, but with the logic that it's triggered by your policy shocks, because you have 15 years really there. I hope I didn't freeze. Sometimes the broadband isn't great in Britain. The next question related to government spending is whether you're allowing for any multiplier effects of government spending, or is it just £1 government spending? Well, in this case, 1 won government spending leading to 1 won increase in GDP. Or do you have any greater than 1 multiplier effects is what I would be after. And last point, you said that the shift from unpaid labor to paid labor, or non-GDP production to GDP production, in its own right may not necessarily be welfare enhancing, which is true, but you also use the term change in the bargaining relations in the household. From the women's perspective, it's a whole lot of difference if you're doing unpaid labor or paid labor in terms of your positioning within the household, but also in the society. And further effects of that on norms. I would like to see again a change in, for example, your Beckerian gender discrimination coefficient or other substitution coefficients. As women do more paid work, social norms or taste for discrimination, all that should be endogenously changing. And thereby, it can't just be static, that's all I'm trying to say. But thank you, very interesting overall.
Great. Thank you. So now we are a little bit short on time. I see Beth and Ito both have their hands up. So let's take those two questions. If you can try to be a little bit concise, and then I'll try to give people a chance to respond. Ito, I think you had your hand up first, actually. So do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you for really interesting presentations. I really enjoyed it. I just had a question. This mainly relates to both Emel and Martin's papers. I'm wondering about the sort of substitution effects of men and women's paid and unpaid sort of work, and also substitution effects of the paid men's paid hours and women's paid hours. Because I think the labor market in South Korea is not as fluid as in other countries. It has a very dualized labor market where women are basically pushed to the peripheral labor market. And so if you look at the proportion of women, something like close to 40% of women are working as contract workers. That doesn't even include the part-time workers, right? So I wonder if that is the assumptions used for the simulation might need to be corrected sort of in light of the labor market or institutional structures of the of Korean labor market. Thank you.
Thanks, Ito. Okay, Beth.
Yes. So this is also for Martin. So I like this point that this assumption that you guys made, which is that services produced by the household is an imperfect substitute for market-produced services. So I think that is in fact, I think, a real consideration when we talk about, because we tend to talk about paid and unpaid care as sort of substitutable. So I like that very much. But I just wondered whether in your simulations you played around with that degree of substitutability, because one would think that a challenge for both the market, the paid care producers, as well as for the government, is to produce better and better paid care services, higher and higher quality. So that seems to me a thing to think about, and how you would reflect that in the parameter that you use for imperfect substitutability between the two care goods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think the questions were for Martin and Emel, and so you each have like a minute and a half. So please be very concise. Emel, I guess you could go first.
Okay. First of all, I appreciate deeply for all the questions and for the interesting resources, everything in the chat room. Özlem, very pleased to see you again. And great idea, 35 hours. We'll definitely work on that. But perhaps we need a national representative data set. And maybe we can work on Turkish data, time use data, which should have a larger sample size. And it's a great idea to work on that. And this is a very specific group. They prefer, the answers given why the mother is taking care of children were like the largest group were thinking about a mother should take direct care of her child. And the other one is cannot trust external services. But when we see that if And they don't use grandparents help, etc. Largely, but the group is very specific. So they trust their spouses more than external services, actually. That's why we tried to model this, but I got great ideas, comments about to improve the modeling and to see, and it's a great question, Ito and Beth, about substitution. Substitution between the men's and women's paid hours is definitely a big, great assumption. I know from the Turkish case, we have also very dualized market, but to link it with the macro simulation would be a great idea to see the labor demand. And it's linked to Özlem's questions also, labor demand effects. We checked labor force participation outcome, both simulations, what would be the result. But that will be a large assumption to see when they, in raw data, say that it should be the mother, because it's, I mean, it was like a hopeful exercise, simulation exercise. To keep on.
Emel, I think I have to cut you off. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We have to leave a minute for Martin. Okay. Sorry, everybody can chat later and offline. Okay, Martin, your turn.
Okay, thank you very much for all the comments and questions. I will try to tackle some of them. So first, the production function. The assumption is that we are not changing the production function, but I mean, the mathematical form of the production function, but there is substitution, of course. And we thought about introducing productivity effects because of the change, but we did not do that for this version. And we are not increasing infrastructure. We are only increasing like recurring spending by the government. Like so it's not capital spending. So we have that channel in the model. We are not using that for this particular set of simulations. Then the multiplier effect, that will really depend on the simulation, because there is an employment in the model, in the sense that there can be a movement of the production possibility frontier, let's say, but we also have to finance the increase in government spending, and that will have an impact on the income side of the households at the same time, because we are raising taxes to pay for the increase in government spending. Then quickly, the dual labor market. We are taking that into account through a low value for the elasticity of substitution between women and men within the GDP activities, let's say. Okay, I will stop here so that I'm on time.
Super. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm not sure, do I turn the baton here or the microphone back to Shireen or Nancy?
Thanks, Mieke. I think we are ready to start our next session, which is a 30-minute discussion with Nancy Folbre, Young-Ok Kim, Caren Groen, and Emel Memiş. And per Nancy's suggestion, I think Young-Ok will go first, but I'll turn the mic over to Nancy.
I just want to say, really great session, really good idea. I think I already did unmute myself. Yeah. So so now a little bit more free-form discussion of kind of research needs, and a lot to say in a small amount of time. So I'm going to ask Young-Ok to go first.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to say what are the critical research and evidence gap in care work and the economy. And this, in fact, the care work and economy project, as we know, has tried to develop macro models in order to explain care economy, and over the 3 years. And during this journey, we witnessed significant achievements. but I might say it is not enough. Efforts should be extended to modify existing macroeconomic models. Besides CGE model, we tried to develop the CGE model, but we haven't done the overlapping generations and Keynesian and post-Keynesian models and more. And another research gap is found in the area of recovery of corona pandemic. COVID-19 is prevalent over a year, and it is not possible nor desirable for a society to go back to the right where it was before. Simply recovering pre-pandemic indexes such as GDP and employment rate cannot be an ultimate goal. Then what should be our goal? I might say maybe the goal should be so-called decent care economy or full care economy. And how much money should be allocated to safe care measures within the COVID-19 recovery packages, and how much money needed to address the care crisis while building back the recovery, building back the economy. Another concern is the coronavirus makes care deficits more worse and exacerbate inequality. As an example, there is a report about COVID-19 and the gender gap in working hours. School and daycare closures increase the caregiving responsibilities for working parents, especially working mothers. Mothers with children have reduced their work hours 4 or 5 times more than fathers. Another Korean recent work showed married women with the children after the corona break, they were unemployed or moved out of the labor market far more than fathers. Therefore, cutting-edge researches are needed to analyze how corona exacerbated care provision gaps and inequality. And another issue is what are the challenges in conducting this research? I don't know much about the methodological challenges, so I just mentioned about the data limitations. Korean Time Use Survey is implemented every 5 years, and the more recent data, and the most recent data is the survey of 2019, and the next survey will be done in 2024. It means Time Use Survey cannot catch any changes due to corona pandemic. I will suggest to Statistics Korea to shorten the survey cycle or to do intermediate surveys with an abbreviated format. And lastly, I'd like to say about how can we influence more researchers, in particular economists, to pay attention to and investigate the care work and the care economy. I think that this question is very desperate and important. I think we can learn from the experience of this care work and the economy project. This project articulated the research areas like rethinking macroeconomics and gender-aware applied modeling, etc., and support related researches. And in result, today we can enjoy the 18 working papers and 10 policy brief in the website. as a coordinator of Working Group 3, when I organized the expert meeting in order to review construction of Korean social accounting metrics and estimation of CG model for Korea, I had a hard time to locate and invite relevant economists. And I could not find anyone, particularly among young scholars. Most of the studies in Korea about care and social care expenditure and care ethics and care policies have been done by the experts majored in sociology or social welfare. With this experience, I became to believe money matters, and I proposed to form a so-called research fund for care economy in order to tap talents of young economists into this research area, such as developing the new cutting-edge macro models or care policy researches or care infrastructure researches. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That last idea is particularly, really sounds great. Emel, would you like to go next?
Yes, adding on Young Bok's points, actually, I'll just mention some of the data challenges we've been facing in our own research and then extend to the general issues about time use data. One of the most important challenges we faced was about the information on income and consumption patterns of the households. So it was difficult to bring the time use patterns together with the monetary well-being or welfare of the households. That's one point. Still, some of the data is not rich about that, except the Korean one we worked on. And I think one of the challenges that we need to think about is the more detailed information about paid work time, because given the pandemic situation, the distinction between the workplace and the home has been disappeared. So we don't know much about paid work activities, except for the length of it in terms of time. You know, measuring with time is sort of limited. And I was thinking about the intersectional inequalities, given the Turkish situation, like the regional inequalities and ethnic-based inequalities, in addition to gender, because there has not been much research about that, except for a small sample surveys. So it will be important to raise that issue as well. And given other hierarchies in time use data. And in addition to that, diary method is extremely important, and all household members' information is extremely important for economists especially. There has been a much richer literature among the sociologists, but economists somehow, forget that the field of economics is actually started from the analysis of households. So it's very important to convince them, to remind them this without analyzing, without those information, you cannot understand the whole economic sphere, etc. And I think during the pandemic, there has been a lot of attention. Probably they spend more time at home and they realize how important also themselves, all the activities that's going on at home. And we should link with the monetary sphere much concretely. I think it's time to think about using time use data in new strategies for our new life, new normal, perhaps post-growth society. And the way from, the term care economy is somehow Eurocentric way of saying the importance of the relation between economic life and care work. So we need to strategize towards caring economy to caring society, caring not just for children and elderly, but everybody around us, etc. So time use data could be very helpful in that sense, with all the richer information, detailed information. And for countries like us, I think it's very important to use different classifications of activities which are very different than Eurostat classification, could be very different. Final point, I think we need to think about more, I don't know how to do it with the time use diaries, but it could give a lot of information about child labor, how unpaid work activities which are unseen, not just for adult women, they are unseen for girls especially, which is preventing their access to education, and hence whole life inequalities come after that. So I think I'll leave there. Whenever something comes up, I'd like to jump in.
Thanks. I do think there's a really good agenda for us to try to provide a more critical analysis and improvement of time use survey instruments. So I think we should kind of put that on our list of things to fix. Caren, your turn.
Hi. It's so great to be back and see everybody. And I'm really sorry I missed yesterday's conversation. I don't get enough opportunities to have to participate in these kinds of meetings. So thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion of the papers. So let me pick up on the last point that Nancy made. I actually have been thinking about this in the context of COVID, where we've had to really pivot in terms of survey methods to using remote technologies, phone-based, telephone sampling, phone-based surveys. And I started to think about whether, I don't know what a new normal might look like, and maybe we'll go back in person with the kind of paper, diaries and so forth. But as we think about technology and new technologies, how can we improve upon the time use data using the new technological tools, and what does it mean? Can we do something in the context, for instance, of a household survey that uses telephone technology or other things, or using, just building on some of the CAPI and other stuff. So that is something that I would be interested in hearing about. A few more things on the research that, I think is really important. So in the world that I'm currently part of, I really think that much more research needs to be done to really make the case for care as part of economic infrastructure. We just somehow, and I think that is really important. And it may be made, that case may be made in the OECD countries, but I think there's harder thinking to be done about how to make that case in low resource, low income environments. And I think we have to think about those settings in differentiated ways, in terms of economic structure, primarily agrarian economies that may be transitioning at some point, or emerging market economies that are already pretty much semi-industrialized, where those issues are really clear. And the issue that I think is particularly important is that it's hard to make an investment case, particularly in those settings when countries don't even have enough money for education and health sector financing. And it goes into the macroeconomics of this, as we all know, in terms of debt finance and deficit, all kinds of other things. But I think we need to really develop some modeling that's specific to those kinds of environments. This relates to another issue that I came out a little bit today. And I think economists need to get more involved in the conversation about social norms. So the issue of take-up of care and what needs to be done to encourage when childcare is available in quote unquote normal times to take that up. I mean, maybe after COVID, there will be greater take-up because everybody realizes the deficits that were exposed. How do we think about changing male norms explicitly? How do we think about the issues of male norms as employees in the sector? Balancing that with, concerns about trust and safety for children. I just think there's a social norm agenda that we could be a good part of that conversation. Finally, I think we need a lot more on the policy simulations. And in terms of different kinds of care policies, more granular. What does it mean in terms of insurance regulations? What does it mean in terms of labor market reforms? So those granular policy simulations, and again, in different types of economic settings, would be very valuable. The last thing I would say, again, from on the research side, from where I sit, is focusing on the elderly, because that's been such an important part of this project. Where I sit, care is not part of that the people who focus on elderly and health, for instance, don't focus on the care dimension. And I really think we could do a lot more to think about some of the health dimensions, like the taking on from the health economists, different types of non-communicable diseases and different risk profiles of elderly who have these different risks of health and what that means for different types of care provisions. We haven't built into our models some of the population issues that I think are really important, like widowhood. Women live longer than men in many countries. And so that might be an emerging research agenda. And the final thing I want to say is about dissemination. I think the work in this project is really fabulous. But I think we need to have a better strategy for how to get it out to the communities that we wouldn't normally reach to help make the kind of case, I definitely want to share all of the papers and policy briefs across the bank communities and so forth. That's not going to be enough though. I have to be, partly because the bank needs to kind of, Beth will know this very well, do it themselves in some way. So we need to give them some help in how they might do it themselves to come to the conclusions that we already know work. But I really think it's useful to think a little bit further about dissemination approaches and not just a release of a paper in a journal or having a policy brief, but how do we really take on having meaningful conversations and using perhaps different methods of blogs or social media here as well. So let me stop there.
Great. I think we've already built a pretty good list, pretty good to-do list here. I want to give time to participants to chime in. Just go ahead and speak. I think that'll work. Or you can raise your hand. While you're thinking, I'll just say that UN Women has actually been doing some really interesting research on public policies towards COVID, and just in response to Young Ok's points, and also work on redesigning time use surveys using a light diary approach, which is more compatible with digital media. So I think there are some really good links with what is going on with this UN Women and UN Statistical Division that we should be mindful of.
Nancy, can I just mention in that regard, there's actually a joint effort with UN Women and the World Bank and the ILO to move towards harmonizing on light time use approaches. And there's some really interesting work that has already emerged in countries like Malawi with experimentation in that regard. And I'll try to find links to share with people.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I think a lot of things are happening in that arena, which is really good. Two participants raised their hands, so do I need to?
I think both Beth and I have raised hands.
Okay, Ito, you go first.
Actually, Beth raised first, but okay. I think these are great ideas. A lot of them I really think we should really follow up on. I think Emel talked about the sort of need for more intersectional approach to research. And I think that's really, really important. And in fact, I think already some of the data agencies like Statistics Canada just recently received a huge grant from the government to rethink their data collection mechanisms. And we are working with them on the specifics of the data collections. And one of the things that we're pushing for is to have more gender, race, and citizenship status disaggregated data in their census and time use and all household surveys. So I think that's something that we should, really do. Another thing is that as a sociologist, I was like feeling really amazed and happy to hear economists saying that economists should work more with sociologists, because we're always more envious of economists' ability to do all this great stuff. So I think what it suggests is that we should have, in terms of the research, we should have more sort of integrated, collaborative research between sociology and economics and other disciplines as well, a much more interdisciplinary sort of research agenda. So thank you.
Yes.
So Nancy, 2 points. One is, I think a little bit more focus probably on immigrants and the role of immigrants in care work is something that I think needs to be taken up. It's not just in the US, it's a lot of places in Europe, but also in Korea. And not being able to identify immigrant status is a real problem, I think. I mean, it's because we, not being able to I mean, one way to do it, I guess, is to ask the question, where were you born or something? But I'm not sure, there are many sensitive questions about immigration status. So we need to think about how to do this work and kind of negotiate those sensitivities about questions about immigration. Second point, Nancy, is that you've led a center that focuses on care. I'd really like to hear about your experience about sort of, have you seen traction with respect to, your interest in care, and where is it coming from, and how can, because the Young Uk's idea about a research fund on care and having a more sort of an institute of some sort on that, I think would benefit from your experience, lessons from your experience for having a care center.
Well, all good points. I'll just say really quickly, I do think care is getting a lot of traction as a research topic, and the Ford Foundation and other 7 other major foundations have announced a major initiative around care issues in the US. However, a lot of it's sort of very applied, and it's harder to get support for kind of research-based initiatives on care. And I just have been working on a proposal to improve kind of the care database in ways that are very consistent with what everybody has said, and haven't had much success in pitching it. But I think if we keep after it, that there is a lot of potential. I think that the experience of COVID, as everybody has pointed out, has kind of energized the discourse. So we should do whatever we can to take advantage of the current moment. I don't know, do other people have suggestions or ideas about this? I think I was really glad to see Gretchen's kind of presentation that connects us with the national transfer accounts. And I think that is an example of a very data intensive project that we should all be paying more attention to, but also one where I think we have some kind of interesting theoretical differences and disagreements that would be good for us to process. And I also think this discussion between, CGE models and more post-Keynesian overlapping generation models, I think this is a very fruitful kind of exchange that's really important to thinking about the care economy. So if we could get if we could create more of a forum for really theorizing some of those kind of big theoretical issues, I think that would really be a great direction to go.
I think Maria Floro has her hand up.
Oh, Sergi, I think you should have the last word.
No, in fact, first of all, I want to acknowledge, thank you for a very interesting and really wonderful panel. But I also want to acknowledge that there are several people in this group that have been working on research on centers and research institutions that have addressed care issues. So I hope that at some point you'll be able to share your own reflection. But that said, I was also thinking that currently, at least in the United States, as well as in Canada and in other places, there are now new initiatives to address care issues, right? The one thing I think that this project can also contribute, or at least the methodologies and the insights from our research can contribute, would be on improving the impact evaluation of those initiatives. Much of the initiatives, for example, let's say on universal care provision, childcare provision in Quebec, tend to focus on, well, what has happened to children in terms of their development, which is very important. Or maybe they could add, oh, let's look at what happened to mothers' labor supply, right? But what this project has shown is that there are several people whose well-being are affected by that kind of initiative. You have the care workers' well-being, you have also the parents' well-being, you have the children both in the short run and the long run, but also the broader community and the economy. Those tend to be missed out in such project evaluations. It's also a way by which, for example, the issue of care be addressed not just by our group or people who are already convinced of care, but people who've been doing a lot of project evaluations. They tend to have this very narrow money metric or growth-related kind of thing. And I think that's one area that we can contribute in terms of methodology, information that they need to do in order to evaluate the effectiveness or trade-offs or tensions that emerge in such initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Yeah. Beth, did you want to chime in?
Just to say that there are, as Sergi was saying, there's actually quite a lot of impact evaluation related to, for example, early childhood development, and and also, of course, on education and health. I think the point I think that Sergi is making, if I might elaborate on that, is that these evaluations talk about the impact on the child. So early childhood education is about the child and the impact on the child. Mm-hmm. If we are going to take a look at a care-aware impact evaluation, then the cost or the toll to the carers of getting a certain level of early childhood development is something that we need to understand better. Yeah. And actually there is a movement, Nancy, to measure costs of program evaluations more. JPAL, for example, but not only JPAL, 3IE are focusing more on costing these programs. What they neglect to measure is the non-monetary cost. They neglect the time cost of actually achieving the kinds of impact that we want. And they also don't include the political cost. There's always a political cost to various interventions.
All right, well, our time is up. I think we have a lot of momentum. We just have to keep going. So thanks to everybody, and hope to see some of you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Okay, good day.
Thanks. Thank you, Nancy.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Join us tomorrow.
Bye.